Zok to Gemara, my time of the Rabbanon, what's the svara of the Rabbanon who hold that the Yitzika does not need to be done by a Kohen? Zok to Gemara, Amarkra, it says, V'yotzak shemen v'nosna la'levayna. Then, after the Yitzika and the placement of the levayna, then and only then, v'yivia el b'nei Aaron HaKohen, and then the Komatz. So clearly, at what point in the process does the Torah introduce the Kohen? Mikmitza ve'elach mitzvahs kohuna, limei al Yitzika b'lila shekser bazar. Rab Shimon, we learned earlier on the Beis, holds that it has to be done dafka al yidei kahanim, and he added kol kohen she'eino moedeba ein loy chelek v'kahuna. So the Gemara, Rab Shimon b'nei Aaron HaKohanim, that it says after Vivia, is referring to mikra nidrash lefanov ula akrav. We apply the v'hubal HaKohanim not only to that it says after that, but it also applies to what it says prior to that, even the Yitzika. Zog to Gemara, v'savar Rab Shimon mikra nidrash lefanov ula akrav. So you're telling me that Rab Shimon holds that whenever there's a pasuk, you can apply what it says side to the former and side to the future. How you talking? V'atanya, I'm going to show you an example of another case in the Torah where Rab Shimon doesn't hold like that. It says in the pasuk, "V'lokach hakohen midam hachatos be'etzboi." The kohen should take from the dam of a korban chatos with his finger, and then v'nosan al karnois hamizbeach, and he should place him on the karnois hamizbeach. Like by a chatos, we know there's a matan on every keren. So we darshan be'etzboi v'lokach. It says v'lokach before a kohen, but be'etzboi v'lokach malamed shloi te kabbalah ela biyamin. So we had a Gemara that taught us that whenever it says etzpa, it means the right one. But the word etzpa isn't mentioned until later. So the etzba is also going back on the velokach. Malamed shiloi te kabbalah ela biyamin. Even when you're capturing the blood, when you're being velokach, you're taking the blood, it should be biyamin. Zok to Gemara, and etzba v'nosan. It also says v'nosan right after betzboi. Malamed shaloi te nesina el biyamin. Each of the matanas dam that are given by the chatos has to be done with the right hand. So you see clearly that according to that's the Tanakama, and the Omer Rab Shimon v'chinemer yad b'kabbalah. It doesn't say yad, the requirement of yad by the velokach. It says it only related to the v'nosan. Zok Rab Shimon, yad b'kabbalah. Since the Torah doesn't say the word yad when we're talking about the Kabbalah Sadam, kibel b'smoil kosher. So you see clearly, Rab Shimon knows the mikra is not nidrash lefanov. So how could you say that related to the korban mincha, the word Ruval HaKohen applies to what was said prior to even include the Yitzika? The Omer Abaye, and Abaye said, "B'mikra nidrash lefanav v'la'achav kamivukli." That's precisely what they're arguing about. Ela, higher time of Rab Shimon, we're going to have a new svara for why Rab Shimon requires a kohen, even for what's prior to the pasuk that says aviyah kohen, because it says avav. The aviyah means vav moisev al inyan rishon. The fact that it says V'hiviyah l'kohen tells us that even what we said before, referring to the Yitzika and the Nesinas L'Oina, that also needs to be done by a kohen.
But it's refuting this simple shot of the pasuk. If it's V'hiviyah l'kohen, then you didn't have it to a kohen before.
So I would agree that it's refuting the simple shot. That's right, it does. The vav is mechaber. Zog to Gemara. V'savar Rab Shimon the vav ma'asev al yin rishon. Does Rab Shimon hold that the vav is ma'asev? I'll show you another place where he doesn't hold like that. Elamayata tichsiv v'shachat es ben abakar v'krivui b'nei aharon hakohanim es adam. I'm sure he does, yeah. Our 2 days are on the same mahalach. Simply pshat. The simple pshat of the pasuk doesn't seem to say that it's also applying to what was said before. I agree, and for sure they also agree as well. V'shachar es bil habokar v'ikrivu b'nehar ha'kodim es adam v'zoku es adam. Oh, he's laughing.
Thanks for the plug.
What's that?
Thanks for that.
Okay. V'shachar es bil habokar v'ikrivu b'nehar ha'kodim es adam v'zoku es adam. What do we learn from there? Mikabol va'elech is mitzvahs kahuna. Melamed al shchita shekseir bizar. What does it say? It says v'shachar es bil habokar, and then it says v'ikrivu b'nehar ha'kodim. So if you hold the vav, will also attach the earlier part of the pasuk to it. So then it shouldn't. Ilar Rab Shimon vav moisef al inyan rishon shchita chanami bizar tei psula. According to the way you're explaining Rab Shimon's shita, that the vav also includes what's mentioned prior to the v'avia, it should require, or the v'krivoi, it should require kahuna. And we know shchita doesn't have to be done by a kohen. Zot Gemara by shchita it's different. Shiny Yosef Damer Kra v'samach v'shachat. Really, you would say the vav v'krivoi applies it to what said prior, but we have another conflicting Gilui in the pasuk, where the pasuk says v'samach v'shachat, it says v'samach right before it says v'shachat. If we look up the pasuk inside, first it says v'samach yodoi al roi sha'olah v'nir tzaloi l'chaper alav, and then right after that it says v'shachat. So we dash in mas smicha b'zarm, just like smicha can be done by a Yisrael, which it has to be done by a Yisrael, if the Yisrael is the owner of the carbon, of shchita bizar. So shchita can also be done with a non-kohen. Frank Gemara, if you're going to compare the halachas of shchita to the halachas of smicha, then maybe you should say as well, ima smicha b'bailam av shchita b'bailam. Maybe the bailam have to shech their own carbon. So Gemara, you for sure cannot make the argument that the shchita has to be done b'dafka by the bailam. And I'll prove it to you from a kavachomer. Kavachomer, uma zrika de ikar kabara, loy boy bailam, madach the zrika of any carbon. Doesn't require the bailam. What if the bailam is not a kohen? So clearly you don't need the bailam. Shchita, the lavik kapara. Shchita, which we argue is not the main kapara of the carbon, surely it shouldn't require bailam. But you do learn from the samach that it has to be done, that it's kosher bizarre. In fact, you can't run efsher from efsher. By the zrika, you can't help it. It has to be done by non-bailam, because a Yisrael can't go do the zrika. But shchita, where Yisrael could do the zrika, maybe there the Yisrael, the bailam, would have to do the zrika just like he does the smicha. So at Gemara, we have a specific pasuk that tells us that there's only one place where the bailam have to shech their own carbon, but everywhere else not. And where is that? Golu Rachmana b'Yom HaKippurim. The Kohen Gadol has to shecht his own par by himself. It says v'shachat as par hachatos asher loi. The Kohen Gadol must shecht his own par hachatos. So that tells us, it speaks it out over there. If everywhere the bailam have to shecht their own carbon, why does the Torah have to specify it by Yom Kippur? Elamai, the fact that the Torah specifies it that by Yom Kippur the Kohen has to shech his own carbon, mechlal de shchita ba'alma loy ba'inam ba'il. You see that the normal shchita of a normal carbon does not have to be done by the ba'il. Amar Rav said, Kamakam shedemer Torah v'chuka. Whenever in one place, in one inyan, the word Torah is used and the word chayk is used, enoi elo la'akiv. That tells us that whatever it is that the Torah is requiring in that pasuk is ma'akev even b'di'evet. Zok the Gemara, kasol kadaitach. At first the Gemara understood what Rav meant to say was tarti ba'inon. Not either Torah or chukah means it's ma'akev, but you need both. K'dichsiv zois chukas haTorah, by the paraduma it says both, chukas haTorah. And there we know that everything is ma'akev by the parsha of Parah Aduma. Frank the Gemara, is that true? V'arei Nazir. We know that in the parasha of Nazir, the Torah says, the loy ksiva be'ela Torah. It only says Torah. As the Torah Hashem quotes, V'zeis Torah sa-Nazir, asher yidar karbono l'Hashem al Mizrah. So there it only says Torahs, but it doesn't say Chukah. For he knows it like Siva El Torah. The Omer Rav, and Rav said, Tenufa ben Nazir MeAkev. The Tenufa that a Nazir does is MeAkev even b'di'evet. Obviously, because it says Torah. It doesn't say Chukah as well. So tomorrow Shani Yosam, Kivan Dechsiv Kein Yasa, Command Dechsiv Abahu Chukah Dami. And if you look in the Torah or Shalom, if we read the pasuk of the Nazir, it says Zois Torah Sa Nazir, Asher Yidor Hashem, Asher Yidor Karbono Hashem, Al Mizrei, Milevad Asher Tasek Yodoi, Kefi Nidroi, Asher Yidor Ken Yasa. Ken Yasa is the nusach that the Gemara is telling us here, makes it that everything is MeAkev. That's how you know that the Tnufa is MeAkev. Zok to Gemara, Harei Toda. What about the Korban Toda? T'leksiv Ela Torah. So let's look at the Lashon HaPosuk by Toda. It says, V'zeis Toras Zevach HaShlomim Asher Yakriv L'Hashem Imal Toda Yikarvenu, and it talks about halachas, but it says V'zeis Toras Zevach HaShlomim. It doesn't say Chukah, it only says Toras. Yet, what's the halacha? V'tani, arba shebetoida. The four different types of breads that have to accompany a korban toida. Ma'akvin zeh. If one set was missing, the korban is possible. So there also only uses the word Torah. Yet we're saying that the halachas of the toida are ma'akiv. To iskish lenazir. We already said earlier by Nazir to tell us that things are ma'akiv. Well, there's a hekesh from Toida to Nazir. T'chsev al-zebach Toidas Shlomov. Where do you see anything about Nazir here? You see it in the word Shlomov. Because if you Amar Mar, Shlomov l'Rabboi Shalmei Nazir. We're also talking in this pasuk about the halachas of the Shlomim that the Nazir brings as a korban. So therefore we're comparing now the Shlomim of the Nazir to the Toida, and they both are ma'akiv. By the Nazir, what's ma'akiv is the Tnufa, and by the Toida, what's ma'akiv is the four breads. Frank the Gemara Mitzorah, T'lechsiv be'ela Torah. It says Zois Torah sa Mitzorah. It doesn't say Chukah. And there's ma'akiv as well. Utnan arba minim shebe Mitzorah ma'akvin zesa. What four species are brought by the Mitzorah? Rashi lists them off. Eitz Erez, Ushni Toilas, Be'ezov, Vitziparim. There are those who say the four minim are very symbolic by the Mitzorah. Eitz Erez, what led the Mitzorah to speak Lashon Hara and to look down upon his friends? Eitz Erez is Gaiva. He was like a cedar tree. You know what he has to use as well? Ushne Toilas, Be'ezov, little things he has to use to bring him down a notch. And then Vitziparim, again, Tziparim triple out it. From talking too much, it led to him getting his tzaras. So Zog to Gemara, there it only says tzaras, it doesn't say chukah. So Gemara, Shani Yosam, Kivon Dechsiv, Zois Tihya, Tzaras HaMitzorah, the Lashon Tihya, Lashon Havaya, Command Dechsiv Bei Chukadami. As Rashi is Tihya, Mashma Ikuva. For Gemara, about Yom HaKippurim. What about Yom HaKippurim? The Lake Siv Bay, by Yom Kippur, all it says is Chukah, El Chukah. What's the Lashon HaPasuk? By Yom HaKippurim, it's in Ois Gimel. V'shachat is ben Avokah Lifnei Hashem. No, it's not here. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong place. It's Ois Yud. I'm sorry, it's not Ois Yud. It's Ois Beis. The Nefesh, no, it's not there either. 1 second. So where is it quoting from? Oh, it's Chaf. I can't see it anymore. In Chaf, the Torah Shalom says, "V'hoysha b'chem lechukas olam b'chodesh hashvi be'esor l'chodesh." So you see the word chukah is mentioned by Yom Kippur, but it doesn't say Torah. And we're assuming according to Rav you need both. Yet Utnan we learned that there's an ikov as well by the halachas of Kippurim. It says Shnei Sira Yom Kippurim, the Sir L'Shem and the Sir L'Azazel, Makvin Ze'aseh. One without the other is not going to be kosher. Ella, we have to change our understanding of what Rav said. Rav didn't say if it says both together, chukah and Torah, that's when it's makiv. Rather, oy Torah, oy chukah. Either one of these expressions mean la'akiv. For the Gemara, if that's the case, Varishar Karbanos, Dichsiv B'hu Torah, remember we had that big hekesh that compares all of the Karbanos together. It says, Zeis Torah la'olah, la'mincha, v'la'chatos, v'la'asham, v'la'miluyim, u'l'zorach ha'shlomim. So you have the word Zeis Torahs, yet we know v'lo ma'akvei, and they're not ma'akiv. The Amar Beper Kama, we said earlier, Be'asham Hu Atzmoi Shalahuktu Emur of Kosher. If you remember, we were talking about if the Emurim have to be Makav L'Shma. So the Gemara says you can't be Makav the Emurim L'Shma. You can't be that you have to be Makav the Emurim L'Shma, because we know even if you weren't Makav the Emurim at all, even if you were not Makav the Emurim at all, it's still going to be kosher. So you see, there's no Ikavek on this. You don't have to do the Aktorah. Zok Gemara, Torah bei chukah v'chukah loy bei Torah. Yes, the word Torah does not indicate that it's ma'akiv, but the word chukah does indicate that it's ma'akiv. So when it says Zeis Torahs la'olah v'mincha, that Torah doesn't know anything, but chukah, in fact, is ma'akiv. For Gemara, v'Torah v'chukah ka'amar. Didn't Rav say whenever it says both? So how could you just decide that that's not what he meant? What Rav means to say, if it says Torah and Chukah, it's ma'akiv. What Rav meant to say is, even though it says Torah, it will be ma'akiv. If it says Torah with Chukah, you see the Chukah in the Eloi loy. But it doesn't need to say Torah, it needs to say Chukah. That's the key word that it should be ma'akiv. What about the korban mincha? Tichsiv b'chukah, but mincha does say chukah. And what is that? My mem, let's look at mem. It says, v'hikya kohen es askaroso migirsa umishamo akol v'nosa. Oh, it doesn't say there. It's in mem. Let's look at mem. Well, kol zocha v'morayim echloma chok olam l'doyosechem. So it says chok olam by kol zocha v'echloma in reference to the mincha. So by mincha, tichsiv b'chukah, v'amarav, and Rav specifically said by the mincha this halacha. Kamokim shehichzur hakosuf, the Torahs mincha ene la'akiv. Whenever the Torah repeats a halacha in the parish of mincha, it's la'akiv. Why would I need the Torah to repeat itself by mincha to show that it's ma'akiv? Everything by the mincha should be ma'akiv, because the Torah refers to the korban mincha with the word chukah. Zok the Gemara, so you see that the chukah does not make a ma'akiv. Rav needed the fact that the halacha would be repeated. So Gemara shiny hosam by mitach chukah doesn't mean everything's ma'akiv. You know why? The chiksiva chukah achila ksiva. When it says chukah, it's not referring to the pasuk that talks about the avodah of the mincha. Rather, it's referring to the pasuk that's talking about the chiyuv to eat it, as we said earlier. So the chok olam is said in reference to the fact that the kohen eat it, not in reference to the avodah. Therefore, Rav had to say by the korban mincha, only something that's repeated is going to be chayiv even b'di'evet. Now, do we have an example of something that was repeated? We did, right at the beginning of this parak. Rashi told us that the mitzvah of Yitzika is mentioned twice, and that's why it's ma'akev b'di'evet, right? That's why the Gemara said that the Mishnah doesn't mean he didn't make Yitzika at all, because it's ma'akev, it just means that he didn't do it with a kohen. Right? That's how the parak started. So Zok to Gemara, the lechem aponim. What about the lechem aponim? It also says, "V'chalu b'makom kodesh, ki kodesh kodesh shemu, is Hashem chak olam." But b'lechem aponim, which is also a type of mincha. But b'lechem aponim, b'chiksiva chuka achila ksev. The lashon chuka is the same lashon as it says it by the mincha. So the chuka, the ikon, is only referring to the achila. Yet we learned utnan shnei sidor ma'akfen zeh. You have to have 2 rows of 6 breads each. If you have one and not the other, it's going to be MeAkev. Shnei bezichen, there's 2 bezichen levoina. Again, ma'akven zeh. You need to have both. Hasidor and bezichen, ma'akven zeh. If you only had the bread or only had the bezichen, it wouldn't be kosher. You need both. So and there it says choik chukah, but it says l'gabi the achila, right? It's the same choik as mentioned by the mincha. Ella, we have to revise. Ela kolecha d'ksiva achila akula mos ksiva. You have to say that even though by the lechem apolim it's relying on the same chukah which is mentioned by the achila of the mincha, nevertheless it's akula mos ksiva. Everything will be MeAkev. So if that's the case, Zaktumar shiny hosam, which is shiny hosam gabi mincha lahachi lahava chuka tida ikuva. So really, even if it's by the achila, it would be an ikuv. Lemaisa by mincha, Rav said you need something else. You need that it should be repeated. Why is it that by mincha the chuka is not valid? Because there's a different reason there. Shiny awesome the Omakra mi girsa umi shamna. The Torah specifically is stating, what am I makbid on? I'm only makbid on the flour and on the oil. As Rashi says, Shiny awesome gabi mincha lochi lehav a chuka dida ikuva. You know the gabi the halachas of mincha, the word choik is not MeAkev. That's not because it's written by the achila. Rather it's mishum the ksiv mi girsa umi shamna. In that pasuk, right? We quoted the pasuk earlier. It says there in the pasuk, the nefesh kisakriv. No, it wasn't there. It was. Let's see if we can find the pasuk. Migishor yishano or that samach. It says the hidra kodesh has kol yasor migirsa umishano al kol yasor. So the Vivaldi Torah repeats that midumasi l'michtav migeresh umishemen. It didn't have to say girsa, its flour, its oil. According to you said, from the flour and from the oil. Uchsiv migirsa umishamna shemamina hachik amar. This is what the pasuk is telling us. Girsa sholem ushmena sholem. You have to have the full measure of oil and the full measure of flour. Shemchas or koshu pasel. Now the israch l'michtav lahachi. The fact that the Torah had to specify that you needed to have the exact amount, the proper amount of flour and oil, obviously the Torah is saying the fact that it says chukah doesn't teach that to you. You need it from Gershon and Mishamah. And therefore, Rav said, since we don't look at chukah as being an ikov, when it comes related to the korban mincha, therefore, for anything else that you want to say is MeAkev, it has to be repeated. Geresh v'shemen ma'akvin v'ein dover acham MeAkev. That's what the Torah is telling us. So therefore, you need another support, like it's repeated. Okay, so finally we got clarity in Rav's halacha. Rav said that if it says chukah by itself, it's MeAkev. The only exception to that is the korban mincha, and that's because it says migirsu mishamna to tell us that those are MeAkev, but other things wouldn't be MeAkev. And therefore, unless it's repeated in the halachas of the korban mincha, it would not be MeAkev. Now let's go drill down in Rav's halacha. Gufa Amar Rav, Chamokam sheich shalach hakosov b'toras mincha. Whenever the Torah repeats a halacha in the parsha of the korban mincha, enoi elo la'akev. That's a sign that it's MeAkev. It's b'di'evet. U'shmuel Amar, no. Geresh v'shemen ma'akvin. The only halacha by a korban mincha that's MeAkev is the right amount of flour and the right amount of oil. Ve'ein dover acham MeAkev. But nothing else is MeAkev. Like the yitzika, right? That's what we learned. It's mentioned twice. Zokor u'shmuel af al gav the Tana Bekra lo MeAkva. Are you telling me logically it doesn't make sense. Is Shmuel really going to is Shmuel really going to say that even if the Torah repeats it, it's not MeAkev? That's inconceivable. Ella kolecha the Torah beikra vade makva. Shmuel cannot argue on Rav's halacha. If it's said twice, if it's mentioned twice in the Torah, he has to concede that it is MeAkev. But for hacha b'meloi kumtzoi b'kumtzoi kamiflagi. There's a halacha that we learned from meloi kumtzoi and kumtzoi, meaning in one pasuk it says the kamat misham meloi kumtzoi, he should take a kamitza the size of his kamitz, and it says in another pasuk the hayom imenu b'kumtzoi. So why does one pasuk say meloi kumtzoi and the other pasuk says kumtzoi? So we learn. The time we learned, Malay Kumtzai, Bikumtzai. He should take the shear of Malay Kumtzai in his kaimetz, in his hand, Shalayasa Midala kaimetz. What it's telling us is, why don't we just have a kohen do a kmitza, let's measure the content, and let's make a custom spoon that will be that exact size. If it was just like Malay Kumtzai, then yeah, I could use a spoon to take that amount. But the Torah repeats it with Bekumtzai Shalayasa Midala kaimetz. So the question is, was that mentioned twice? Is that MeAkev or not? Rav holds Hanami Tana Beikra. This halacha was repeated. Where was this halacha repeated? It was repeated by the Shemoyna Shimei Ameluyim Dichsiv Vayaker V'Samincha Vayimalei Kapei Mimena. So that's a second mention where it has to be done with his hand and not with a keli. So that's what Rav meant. If it's halacha repeated, and he's referring specifically to the halacha that the kmitza must be done dafka with the kohen's hand, and he can't use a keli, he learns from there that it's mentioned twice, once by the regular parasha mincha, once by the miluyim, that in fact it's MeAkev to use his hand. Shmuel said, Dorosh Mishal Afina. From the halacha that he has to take it in his hand, mentioned by the Maluyim, that doesn't count. Because that wasn't the halacha of mincha. That was the specific instructions for the Shemei Shemei HaMiluyim, where things were done differently during that period of time. And therefore you can't learn it. So that's how Shmuel meant to say, Ger for Shem MeAkev, Bein Davar MeAkev, meaning not the fact that it can't be done in a keli, because Rav held that was repeated. Where did Rav say that was repeated? It was repeated in the halacha of having to do the kmitz with your hand. Shmuel holds it's not repeated because you cannot look at the ladoiris. Are you telling me according to Shmuel you could never learn a halacha from something that was only mentioned once for a specific time, like Maluyim? You can't apply that to something that's Nagel L'Dorais. But now we learned this Mishnah in Zvachim as well. Kli alach, if you have a measuring keli that's designed to measure liquids, Mekachin es alach, it's only going to be Mekadosh liquids, because it's specifically designed only for liquids. But Umidas Yavesh, and the same thing with kelim that are designed to measure dry amounts. And those were only Yisarn and Chatzi Yisarn, Mekachin is Yavesh. If you put flour into it, it will be Mekadosh, because that's what the keli is supposed to be used for. But the Enkli Alach, Mekachin is Yavesh, well, it means Yavesh, Mekachin is Alach. In other words, the Klisharish will only be Mekadosh what's supposed to be in it. V'yomar Shmuel, and Shmuel said, Lo shanu elamidos. This that we say, that a klilach will not be Mekadosh Yavesh, that's if the klilach was a measuring keli. If it was a measuring keli, and you never use it to measure flour, only liquids, that's what we're referring to, it won't be Mekadosh. Avol Mizrakos, what if this klei alach wasn't a measuring keli? It was just a regular container, like used to hold the blood that you're going to spritz on the mizbeach. That's Mekachin. That doesn't have this restriction. How do I know? How do I know that you can have a keli that's designed to hold lach? Even if it holds Yavesh, it will be Mekadosh, because we have a pasuk by the Maluyim. When the Nisim, by each of the karbanos of the Nisim, it says, it says in the pasuk, I want to quote the whole pasuk, it's a very famous pasuk. It says, Korbonoi, Karas Kesef Achas, Shloshim Umeh Mishkalo, Umizrok Echot Kesef, Shivim Shekel B'Shekel HaKodesh. So there's a Mizrok and a Ka'ara, and what were they full of? Malayan Keteris, right? What's the Lashon of the pasuk? The Korbanah is Kesef Achatz, Shloshim Umeh Mishkalo, Mizrok Echot Kesef, Shivim Shekel B'Shekel HaKodesh, Shnei Malayan Solas, V'lulu B'Shem in the Mincha. They're both full of solas. So you see they're clay halach. A mizrach is made to hold on, yet it's still mekadosh the solas. So you have a raya from there that a clay halach will be mekadosh the yavesh. But that's only a case of Ladoris. That was by the Nesiim. And the Mishnah says, how do we know that a clay for lach could be mekadosh yavesh? You know it from the Nesiim. So you see clearly, Shmuel holds you could learn from the Nesiim, which is not Ladoris, it's only Lashah. So to know the Nesiim is different. Shani Hasam, the Torah Bikra, Trei Sarzimne. That same pasuk is listed 12 times, right? When it's listing after Nesiim, when it says it 12 times, yeah, there would be MeAkev, even though the pasuk is only speaking for that specific time. But it says it 12 times. Amar of Kahana, for Abasi Larav, for Agosha. What about the mitzvah to bring the mincha to the corner of the Mizbeach? The Tana Bakra, that also is repeated twice. V'lei ma'akva, and it's not ma'akev. Where is it repeated? So first we have to know where is the first place that it's mentioned. So the first place that it's mentioned is the first place that it's mentioned is the following pasuk. I'm going to quote the pasuk in a minute. It says, "V'veisa es hamincha asher yasa me'elo Hashem v'krida lakoin v'gisha al hamizbeach." That's the main pasuk by mincha where the Torah discusses Agosha. Where is it? Ibrik has it. T'chsiv zeis Torah hamincha hakol v'yisor b'nei Aharon lefnei Hashem. So there it's repeated. And nevertheless, we say Agosha is not ma'akev. Zot Gemara, the reason why the repetition of Agosha is not making ma'akev, because it's teaching us another very important thing. It's teaching us where the Agosha has to be. Yes, it says Vegisha, but it doesn't say where you should bring it. The second pasuk where it's repeated, it says Lefnei Hashem, to tell us that where on the Mizbech does it have to be brought to, an area on the Mizbech that's Lefnei Hashem. What does that mean? The title Lefnei Hashem, Yochel B'Mayr, you would think that Lefnei Hashem means on the west side of the Mizbech, because that's right opposite the opening of the Heichel. Talmud Lomar Pnei HaMizbech. The pasuk also says it's got to be at the front of the Mizbech. When you're walking up to the Mizbech, you're facing its southern wall. So is it the southern wall, or is it the western wall? Yop the Mizbech, Yochel B'Dor. Talmud Lomar Lefnei Hashem, it's got to be Lefnei Hashem, which is B'Mayr. How could you have a compromise that will satisfy the Pnei HaMizbeach and also satisfy the Pnei Hashem? You will bring the Hagosha of the Mincha to that corner, to the southwestern corner. So it has south and then it has west. Right at the point of a diary, that will be adequate. You would have thought you bring it on the west side. Or the or on the south side, let's say. If you have two psukim, one pasuk, if you follow it to the T, it's going to not be a contradiction. It won't be a conflict with what was said in a different pasuk. But if you follow the other one to the T, it's not going to be consistent with the requirement in the other pasuk. Ultimately, what you do is what will satisfy the requirements of both psukim. And let's provide a detail. If you're going to say it has to be done on the Ma'ariv side of the Mizbeach, it won't be B'Darim, it'll be on the west. But if you're on the south side of the Mizbeach, it's not a contradiction. Kiyamta lifnei Hashem. How does that make sense? The teretz is the heicha kaimasa. How are you mekayim it? How does that make sense? Amar Rashi, kasover hai tana. This tana holds kulo Mizbeach b'tzafan kai. The Mizbeach is entirely on the north side of the Azara. So if the Mizbeach is entirely on the north side of the Azara, that means the southern wall of the Mizbeach lines up perfectly to the entrance of the Heichal, to the center of the entrance of the Heichal. So you could be on the dome side of the Mizbeach, but you're Lifnei Hashem, you're directly across from the opening of the Heichal. So, what about the Chiyuv to put salt on the Kmitza? The Torah did not repeat it twice. MeAkev, it's MeAkev, the Tanya Bris, Melach, Olam, Hu, Shetehei, Bris, Amur, B'Melach, to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says we know it always has to have Melach, because there's a Bris, and Rabbi Shimon doesn't argue in the halacha, he just learns it from a different pasuk. Nemar kan Bris, Melach, Olamu, V'nemar La'alam, Bris, Kunas, Olam, Kishem, Sheyavshir, L'Karbanis, B'Lai Kahuna. Just the same way the korban needs a kohen, kach yavshur l'karbanos b'loy melach. So the question here is, melach is not repeated, yet it's still MeAkev. That's what we're going to stop at that kasha, and we will, Be'ez Hashem, be mamshech tomorrow. So this Gemara is